Welcome to Geekview Tavern on the Road, as the guys at the end of the bar take the show to WonderCon 2022 in Anaheim. Stay tuned to learn amazing and extremely valuable career advice for aspiring video game designers, creators, artists, and writers. I'm your host and bartender, Dave Olbrich. Do you know the best websites to show off your work? What is UI and what the heck is UX? And why is it the hottest job descriptions in gaming? Be sure to stay tuned until the end as we answer questions from the audience. Remember to like the episode, leave a comment below, share it with friends, and please subscribe. Okay, Skeeter, hit the intro.
I'm Steve Peros. I'm the author of the relaunch of Billy Tucci's She, as well as Stoker Wells, and movies and television, and I welcome you to Geekview Tavern.
Well, thanks for coming. This is going to be a panel about how to convert. You've got some skills in comic books, or required some skills in storytelling and comic book art, writing, creation, how you can change those into the kinds of skills that can be used to gain yourself a career in video game production of one kind or another. Does that sound about right, Paul? Sure. Okay. Thanks. My name is Dave Olbrich. I'm the host and the bartender at Geekview Tavern. Billy has not yet appeared on Geekview Tavern. We're going to fix that sometime soon, but Paul's a regular guest, and Tom at the end there is my co-host. So let me pull that slide up. So there we go. So anyway, if you have trouble seeing us, that's kind of what we look like. Billy especially looks good in that photo, you got to admit.
You didn't know they were using that.
I did not. It's my Instagram.
Yeah. Right, so Tom's here as the co-host of the Geekview Tavern, but Paul and Billy both have got skills that are translatable from comics to video games, and we have another person on the way that's a part of the Geekview Tavern family called Chris Holm, who will be here shortly, who also worked at Malibu Comics, who's the editor-in-chief of the Ultraverse, and has successfully created himself a wonderful comic book career. Do you want to guys go over the basics of like where you started and how you translated that stuff? I mean, sure. Just the Reader's Digest for
Reader's Digest. So in high school, I drew all the time, and I wanted to get into comics, or I wanted to go work at Disney. One of the two. It's very lofty, right? And one pays better, but than the other. And I moved out to California, and a friend of mine was working in games, and that's how I got it. And back in like the late 90s and the early 2000s, it was a little easier. If you knew somebody, you could get in a little easier, right? But then you had to prove it. So once you were in, you had to like show the skill. So you had raw skill, you usually could get in. Now it's a little tougher, but.
Right.
And then I've been in games for 20 years, and in between that, I would do comics here and there. Mostly cover stuff, mostly illustration stuff. So.
Is there anything that you've done that somebody would kind of know you for?
I worked on the Deadpool game.
Yay!
I worked on the Transformers franchise video games,
nice.
War and Fall for Cybertron.
Cool.
And Lionforge Comics did some, they had like 80s, they had like Knight Rider and
right.
Airwolf, and
Yep.
I did the covers for those.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
What about you, Paul?
I noticed the onus here to the party.
Yay!
I've been doing video games since before the Earth cooled.
Yeah.
Seriously, when I began video games, the dominant platforms were the Atari 2600.
Wow.
The ColecoVision, Texas Instruments TI-9948.
Wow.
And television.
Yep.
Did games for all those. I made robot games for Nolan Bushnell after he left Atari and was writing on non-compete. So I've done some weird things, right? My first video game job was over 40 years ago. It's terrifying to admit, 1981, I think, 81, 82. Right. And since then, I've worked with Interplay, I've worked with Capcom, I've been in Electronic Arts, Daybreak Studios, presently with Amazon, game director at Amazon. For about a year, I was making a Lord of the Rings game there that we were really excited about. Doing something else now I can't tell you about. Also, with my partner here, Chris Ulm, and with Billy King, we had High Noon Studios in Carlsbad, where we did Dark Watch, we did Born Conspiracy. As far as Chris and I together had a mobile company called Yappy Entertainment, where we did some great games, like Trucks and Skulls and Face Fighter. And then my comic business, my comic experience hasn't been nearly as extensive, but I did break into comics with.
Just put your Liberator cover
Oh,
up
thank you,
and
yeah.
Ultra Monthly.
So I broke in with you guys at Malibu back in the day and wrote about, 70, 80 titles for you, both original IP and franchise books. I worked on X Mutants and New Mutants, and we did some adaptations. And then I was there just long enough. I did get one paycheck from Marvel, I think.
Nice.
Yeah, because I wrote an inventory script for Rune for Chris here when the Ultraverse stuff had been folded into Marvel, and the check came from Marvel. So as far as I'm concerned, I work for Marvel. And I put that on my LinkedIn. I think.
Yeah, stick that on your resume for sure.
Yeah.
Mr. Chris, we're just talking about your sort of credentials. Try to keep it in this, a nutshell if you can, but.
So I should go really short because everybody else went long, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, we used up all of your time, so
And you should mention
there's no
Oddworld.
time left for you. That's exactly what I'm saying.
I forgot to mention Oddworld, which is where you started with video games.
Yeah.
Right? When we were there together as well.
Yeah, just real briefly, a lot of the stuff Paul said, we've been partners for a long time, working together, a lot of stuff that David Thomas said, have been partners with both of these guys, both these groups for a long time.
Is your mic working?
Yeah.
Yes.
You
Okay.
guys hear me okay?
They're just falling asleep.
The missing part that Paul didn't talk about was Oddworld, so we got a chance to do, which is very unusual in video games, we got a chance to do a lot of original IP, which normally you don't get a chance to do. And same in comic books. I'm really grateful that I was able to be the editor-in-chief of a brand new superhero universe, which you don't get those kind of opportunities very often unless you're Jim Shooter. So it's great. So that's my credentials. Let's get rolling.
Good man.
Move this thing along. All right, so you can see on the screen right now, we're showing a couple of things Paul worked on, a couple of things Chris worked on. In terms of just writing, obviously Chris did a lot of the work at Ultraverse and Malibu, but Chris was the co-writer of Robotech to the Sentinels, and he and Barry Windsor-Smith created Rune together. So those are the comic book stuff that those guys worked on, at least through Malibu. And then I tried to gather a bunch of logos here about the stuff that they sort of transitioned into. When we talked about Oddworld, talked a little bit about Abby, but when you guys were faced with the end of Malibu, Chris, what was the skill set that you were able to immediately bring to bear, especially when it came to acquiring a job in the video game business?
Yeah, there's a couple things. The main thing is we were also merged with a video game studio, Malibu Interactive, which had formerly been Acme Interactive. So we'd already had some experience in trying to take comic book characters and port them over. But my main experience really came from just my long friendship with Paul, where we did nothing but talk about games and video games and game design, IP design. That was something that we talked about long before I was working professionally in the field, not before Paul, because he's the original old timer in terms of video games. But I think the things that crossed over were how to work with talent, how to process timelines and figure out the pieces of things that you needed to do from a production standpoint. And then also, the emotional aspect of what makes a good game, what makes a good comic book. Why do you go left instead of right when you're on the creative side? And so we were able to do both at High Moon Studios. We did an original game called Dark Watch, featuring a sort of a super heroic vampire character. And we were able to do that all the way through the Ultraverse and through Malibu as well. So a lot of that stuff crossed over, and Oddworld was a very character-intensive, the world and the world building were incredible. Mostly on the part of our dear friend Farzad Bahramian, but also Lorne Lanning, who was the president creator of it. And so it was a great experience to be able to work with that vision and then be able to try to carve out little bits and pieces of it. And that, so that's what I think I brought over to Oddworld. I don't know, Paul, if you agree with that.
No, I think that's all in target. And you came up, it's interesting through our careers at various times. Chris has been the boss, I've been the boss. We've been partners, we don't really think about it. because Chris was my editor at Malibu and was getting me work there. And then when you came to Oddworld to join us as game designer, actually, that's the thing, is that like you paid your dues. You didn't come in and say, I'm a director, I'm going to run this place, right?
Yeah.
You came in and you shipped the game with us and learned the game design trade from the bolts up and built excellent levels for us. And then you ended up staying with Oddworld longer than I did. You did transition into a director role there, as I recall, and you worked with Lauren on the cinematics for the Munch project, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you came up through design, but pretty quickly moved into direction.
So how many people here see themselves on the production kind of writing side, and how many people see themselves? Well, let's do that. But I'm trying to figure out how many of you are on that side and how many are kind of on the art side, like the creative art side more. Let's do writing and production. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and artists, aspiring artists. Yeah, that's not exclusive, right? Yeah, for sure.
You're my people.
There you go. So what would the path be? What would be the best advice you would give people that are aspiring to go where you've gone, Billy, in terms of starting out as an artist, learning your craft, and then transitioning to games? What would be the best advice you would give them in terms of places to start, how to progress, and then how to sort of break in?
Sure. I think overall school is probably less, it's probably bad to say, but it's less of an importance now. It's more about finding the very specific things that you want to do and then go for that. And there's plenty of online classes and things that you can do. So it's less about that. It's more about the passion of which piece of that kind of art path you want to do. Back in the day, a 2D artist would take care of all things. They would take care of the concepts, they would take care of the illustrations if they needed, graphic design and light. Now, all of those are specialized now. So if you're a penciler, if you like comics and you're a penciler and you want to get into games, you'd be a great storyboard artist, for instance, right? It's all about that, it's paneling and things like that. If you like painting or you're more of a cover type artist or pinup type artist, and maybe working at like a place like League of Legends and Riot and doing those big, awesome front rendered painted covers and things like that they do. What I do is it's more design based. It's more, we have a visual problem, how do we solve that visual problem, right? And that, I would argue, you kind of need to go into the entertainment curriculum at like an art center and things like that, because you're working a different part of your brain with that. You're more of a designer, fashion designer, or creature designer, and things like that. If you just want to do straight art to art, there's places for that. If you want to design, you might want to have a little bit of background, either taking classes online there's various art stations and bunch,
Sure.
or going to an actual curriculum like an art center.
Yeah. Now, is there a certain amount of software proficiency that the aspiring people should know about? Like, use this, don't use that, or is it a range, or how do you evaluate the software? And everything's dependent on software now, so how do you evaluate that process?
Well, there's a lot that you can do, and again, there's so much that you can use in current game development, where you can go from Photoshop to Procreate to Clip Studio. Those are 2D type things, and then you have 3D programs like ZBrush and 3D Code, etc. It's a Blender, etc., etc.
Right.
And it kind of depends on what you want to do with that. If you're more of a 3D person, but you draw a little bit, then you can do quick sketches and build it in 3D and then render it out, and that's fine. So your workflows are all different. There's plenty of ways to try all different kinds of stuff. But if you're a drawer, you like to draw, you like to sketch, then Procreate is really good. Put it on your tablet, right?
Right.
Photoshop is the industry standard.
Yeah. I mean, you work with a lot of artists, Paul. What would be your advice to aspiring art types as opposed to aspiring story types or creator types? I realize that these things, the Venn diagram overlaps heavily. I get that.
Sure.
But
I do work with a lot of artists. I don't hire artists specifically, but I think.
What good are you? We can't give some guy a job, but what are you even doing?
I can't.
I did that hire.
Yeah, like I said, I started when the earth cooled, right?
Oh, that's right.
It was back when you could walk on to, like my grandfather, walked on to RKO in the 30s, and a couple years later he was working on King Kong, right? That actually happened. He was also working with Chris's grandfather on that show, which we didn't know until generations later. And it used to be, so in video games, it's the same way. I started in tabletop role playing, right? And I was 18 years old. I wrote a thing called Grimtooth Traps for Flying Buffalo. It's still in print, 45 years later. And that was my calling card to get a video game job, which no one really knew what it was. And when I started, it was, the programmers had all come out of the defense industry, and they were just glad they weren't making missiles anymore. I was like, at least I'm not killing babies, I'll make games. That's the way it was, right? My design mentor was a defrocked priest.
So they went from killing real babies to killing fake babies.
Well, I won't comment to that, but nonetheless, yeah. So the video game business, very different when I started, and everybody, it was like, no one came up wanting to make video games. It's someplace where you wound up.
Right.
But now it is different, and
In those early years.
yeah, in its early years, but now it's different. And when I'm talking to candidates, not necessarily on the art side, but on the design side,
Yeah.
or production or QA or whatever, they're coming out of some kind of program. They're coming out of Full Sail or Carnegie Mellon or LCAT. It's a place Chris works with. Yeah. So, but what we do is, for artists, we have a project right now that Billy and I are working together at Amazon, and we had a crunch and we needed freelancers, and like the first place we went was Instagram and ArtStation, and let's just see what you look like and kind of like that work, and then we'll contact that person individually, maybe for some freelance concept work.
So there's no downside to keeping your stuff on Instagram and then.
Oh, definitely no.
Yeah.
For sure.
Right.
No, that's
in terms
nice.
of getting the word out, like how do you?
Yeah.
Right.
It's a much easier now, I think, for artists. I would assume for writers too, maybe they write and they put it up on places.
Read it. That's
That's why I go to Instagram to read a little story.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not that, blogs or whatever. I draw, man.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You write, I draw.
And animators in that same space need real, right? So you
Right.
can see their work.
Your portfolio is the key.
It is.
Yeah.
Right, whether it's a live feed, not literal live, but like a live feed through Instagrams or through portfolio sites like ArtStation or CG Hub or CG
Sure.
Society,
Yeah.
and then it's all about that. So.
What are your thoughts on this discussion so far, Chris?
Yeah, so my current job is I'm the creative director for a company called Jam City, and it's on the mobile side. So I've worked both on sort of high-end video games, but also, like Paul said, we had our own mobile company, and now I work for a fairly big mobile company. In our studio, we hire a lot of different kinds of artists. So like what Billy and Paul were talking about, a lot of that's conceptual art. That's one big chunk, but there's also technical art, production art. I think they mentioned 3D art as well. You can focus on 3D, but one of the big areas of expansion that we could never find good enough people, and that we're paying gigantic top dollar for, is UI artists and UX artists, because mobile games are essentially just collections of UI, and it's enormously important. And you guys know what the difference between UI and UX is? Okay, sorry. Shouldn't go straight to the jargon card. So UI is user interface. So that's the way that the user interface, when you're playing a game like Candy Crush or any of those games, that's the way it looks, right? The UX is user experience, short for user experience, and it means the way that it works. Like the way that it flows through the game, the way that, which buttons do you press, what are the calls to action, which is another jargon term, is CTA, like which buttons do you push. That's art. That's a mixture of art and design, and incredibly important and incredibly hard to find people that are good at both those things. Finding UI and UX masters, very difficult. So that's an area that's really growing, whereas there's a lot of, you can pretty much throw a rock and find 3D artists these days. But it's really hard, at least right now, to find UI and UX.
And do me a favor, throw it hard.
Because the differentiator.
That's an old joke about writers, by the way. we're not picking on artists.
The differentiator is the design part of it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you can have a skill of drawing, and you can have a skill of 3D art, or you can have a skill of lighting, or really good at textures or whatnot. You're getting a task to do the thing, and so you do the thing, and you're very talented at it, right? And then there's the UX side of things, like Chris was saying, or concept, and it's ideas. It's all about ideas and how do you represent those ideas. So you can do it in a sketch, or you can do it in a painting, but it's the idea that's the important part, and how to foster that. That's kind of the asterisk. That's the hard part.
Yeah. So in a like I think it's easy to forget how many people it takes and like the army it takes to produce this stuff. You want to speak to, like, you talked about all the specialization, Billy. Well, that means there's going to have to be. So how many people does it take to make, I don't know, pick a game that everybody would know, and how many staffers do you think it took to get that done?
Well, if you pick like
We're talking tens, we're talking 50s, we're talking hundreds.
Hundreds, yeah. like a Fortnite, for instance, right?
Right.
Epic or something, that's hundreds. But their internal group might be 100, 150, but then they also outsource.
Right, okay, so it
Then you have to
could be closing out 1,000 people.
Well, maybe that's a little high.
Yeah, you can get to 500-800 people.
Yeah.
Just depends on the game.
Right, 500 or 800 or so.
But as recently as 10 years ago, Chris and I were making mobile games with 8 guys over a bar in Carlsbad, right? So it depends on what game you're trying to make. And,
Sure.
and it's also expanded. Like when we did Oddworld, I don't think the core Oddworld people were more than 22 people in house.
Production people, yeah.
Yeah, and that was a pretty for its day. It was a
And we
pretty
didn't,
advanced.
and we didn't outsource much of anything.
No, we
I
didn't
don't
outsource
think we outsourced anything.
And mine was 50, around 50. Like
Yeah.
when I got into the industry, it was about 50.
But they're growing in terms of specialization in terms of content, and then of course now you have live operated games where you don't really ship them, you just release them and you continue to develop them post launch, and that's a whole different set of skills and use staff.
Update, right?
Yeah, like when we did Abe's Odyssey, I remember we left the wrap party from Abe's Odyssey to go back and actually do some work on the disc that had been submitted as a gold master for Sony, but that was like unusual. Generally you ship it and forget it.
Right, sure.
But now it's like, no, like, shipping is just, that's not the finish line, it's really kind of the starting line.
It's just the first version of the game.
Yeah.
So Billy was talking about not just being on staff at a game, but being freelance. Tom, you're make a lot of your living as a freelance writer.
Yes.
Certainly you don't make any money working at Geek View Tavern. So,
We'll talk about that.
yeah, the check's in the mail, buddy. So what has been your experience like? I'm sure you've been contacted as a freelance writer and you've got contacts. So do you want to speak to working as a writer, as a freelancer on video game projects?
Yeah, so I get called in sort of as a fixer. I don't really create video games, and nobody calls me in and says, hey Tom, can you pitch us your idea for a great game? That never happens. What happens is I get called in, one of the games I did, well, I had some tentative experience in video games. One of my comic books was adapted into a video game, Dinosaurs for Hire, which was done by Sega, and then I edited a Capcom comic book called Street Fighter, which got me to know the people at Capcom, and then Capcom had a studio that had a game that was in some, not really trouble, like the game was going to be fine, the game mechanics were fine, but they didn't like the way it read, and they didn't like the dialogue, and they didn't like the way the dialogue worked in the cutscenes. And so they called me in, and
Hey Tom, what's a cutscene?
I think they would know that.
Oh, is this just me, the old man that doesn't know?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
They would know. And so, okay, Dad.
Sorry.
And so, now I've lost my train of thought.
They asked you to fix the cutscenes.
They asked me to fix the cutscenes. And so what they would do is, they had the game all ready. They had all the levels had been done, and they had two things that they didn't like. They didn't like the dialogue, and they couldn't figure out a way to tie the levels together to create a full narrative. They had these great levels where you had to do certain tasks, shoot certain things, kill certain things, and certain things would pop out, but it never tied into the next level. And so I sat there in their office. I would go in every day for like 4 weeks, and they would play the game for me, and I would watch the game, and then I would just sort of spitball ideas, and then run away, write some script, come back in, look at the game again, and I was never a writer like you think of a writer who just sits alone in a room and just writes stuff out and turns it in. You write stuff out, you come in, there's 8 or 10 people from all departments. There's the creative people, there's the designers, there's the guy in the office who originally came up with the game, there's the owner of the studio, and so everybody's coming in so that everybody's on sort of the same page. It's a real sort of team effort. It took about 4 weeks, and then I'm done. I leave the company, and the game ships, and then somebody calls me in again, and I do the same thing over and over again. So I don't actually create anything. I take pieces of stuff and stitch it all together.
Like a script doctor.
Like a script doctor.
He is
Yes,
exactly.
exactly.
It's Dr. Mason. I can talk to the back end of that as far as what that's like on the staff side, right? Because you're talking from a freelance perspective,
Right.
and I've done that too. Like when I was the design lead at High Noon and we're doing the Bourne Conspiracy, we were working with external screenwriter Sean Jablonski. Sean's, ace writer. He was on Nip Tuck at the time. He's got another show now. Got a big success. And Sean always wanted to work in video games, but he was really frustrated working with us because he came at it from the perspective, I'm the screenwriter and I've written the script, and now the game has to revolve around the script. And it's the other way around. The scripts revolve around the game, and unless you're in-house and keeping track of things on a day-to-day basis, you can't keep up with how fast the game evolves. And usually, sadly, the story is the easiest thing to change in terms of expense and time.
Right.
So the story gets cut, the story gets mutilated to fit whatever game is going on. It's like, so Sean write all these bridging sequences, like, sorry, we cut the Marseille level. What? How? Well, we just couldn't out. So all those plot points that you had there, well, now we need to move them to Switzerland. Can you do that? So it's very frustrating for him. So it's difficult for freelancers to get purchased because you really do need to be in the room. And it's evolved now where you have narrative directors and narrative designers, a subset, of like a more technical side of a story writer. So they'll write the script, but they're working inside the editor to set a dialogue and do all the call outs, they're building quests, they're connecting the bits together, and they're embedded as developers, so they're going to the daily scrums and keeping track of what's going on, and they're going to tell the characters out, or here's this new character that's coming in. And then narrative designer will also, depending on the size of the job, or have a narrative director, they're also involved in voice casting and performance capture and other things to bring the story together. So that is, the theory of the panel is where comic and game skills cross over, and that's definitely a place because there's room for people who write in games. But if you're going to be a writer in games, you better get a staff job, I think, if you really want to have any sort of creative satisfaction. And I also say this too, if you want to be a writer and you're deciding, should I go into games or go into film? Film's a snake pit, but they've got unions and will actually take care of you, right? Whereas in games, we'll chew you up and spit you out. There's no one there to get your back. So if you want to write for games, make sure you really love games. I mean, really, really, really love games because it's a hard problem.
Yeah.
There's never it's like not an auteur theory of the game writer.
Right.
You really have to learn how to not only write and be able to serve the game, but you also are writing with the approval of 8, 10, 15, 20 people in various different departments. So you really have to learn how to serve the game, not necessarily your own words.
And there are auteurs in video games, but they do it all, right? So it's a Ken Levine or it's a Lauren Lanning, our old boss, qualifying, right? So they are people that are engaged as writers, but they're more like to hire and fire you as a writer to help them rather than having a writer come in and tell you how it's going to be, as Sean tried to do on Born.
It's also very different. You don't have the same control. If you're writing a comic book script, you're controlling the pace. You're controlling the introduction of characters. You're controlling the outcomes of scenes. In a game, that all may be up in the air about how that's going to happen, which different outcomes could potentially happen, how fast the player could play through it. And so you have to work. That's why the game designer is preeminent in games. And the narrative is always secondary to what's going on for the experience for the most part, unless the narrative writer is also the game designer.
Yeah, that helps a lot. And then there is actually a crack in the tomb door now. I realize we're talking about live operated games and MMOs specifically.
Yeah, sure, yeah, of course.
So I was with Daybreak, we're working on an MMO at Amazon now. I have a lot of friends in the MMO business. And this place is a little more respectful to writers because the game, the job's better understood. We do a quest. So come in and do a quest and write this main dialogue trunk in these 2 or 3 different. And you can do that externally, maybe. It's still better if you're on site. But that's also a place where, if you're a comic book writer, and you're using, I got a 22-page plot, I got to hit these points, and this character needs the bit. Those are things that, that translates. I'd read, well, I don't think I'd be bothered to read because I'm one of those, I'm like that. Who has time to read? I'll find someone to read this for me, right? But it wouldn't be a case where I could read your graphic novel and go, okay, well, they get it. Like the dialogue snaps a little bit. If I cover up the characters, I can tell who's talking without the assistance of the artist, things like that. And if they can get the spirit of it, then we might take a look at you for writing.
Another place to start is also indie games. There's a lot of smaller games now, a lot of smaller PC games that are very highly narratively driven.
Yeah.
And that's another thing to look at as a writer, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can go work for Naughty Dog and go do Last of Us, but good luck.
We'll try.
Like that's a deep story, right?
Yeah, and that's another auteur-driven product, right? It's a Neil Druckmann game, and you can do it Neil's way. He's going to call you up at 10 o'clock at night and yell at you about the shoelaces and stuff. So these people are crazy people, and that's why they get brilliant art, because they're crazy people. But that they will use writers like matches, I think.
So Tom and Chris and Paul have all written comic books extensively. what did you learn reading comic books that was the most easily transferable to understanding how to do the same thing for games?
Let's all turn to Chris.
Yeah, let's all stare at Chris.
To me, it would probably be dialogue.
Okay.
Dialogue translates really well, figuring out characteristics. Also, how to make a character pop with very few words. You're limited by, the comic book page, and most of us are. Don't clog them up with too many word balloons, right?
Huzzah.
But getting the flavor, and also even action, I think, translates, like trying to make stuff that's over the top, that's crazy, that you can only see in comic books, and then that's something to grasp for in games. If it's a game about a superheroic character, like for example, we did a vampire jump in Dark Watch, which was a really trying to bring that sort of feel of a comic book to the game, and that was inspired by all the games that we played, as well as the comics that we read.
Yeah, I might add, one of the things I thought translated was understanding in comics that the action is the exposition and the dialogue is kind of the nugget, it's there for fans to read. So you know that Peter Parker is going to be the Green Goblin, you know he's going to get the date with Mary Jane. So where's the stakes that you're finding?
Sure.
But so the action and the background is very artistic driven. People are looking at that. If the characters are speaking to each other, that's kind of a little froth on top. And there is some of that in games as well. I forget the jury I was on years ago, some IDGA, I think we were doing Game Awards. And the first Uncharted came to us, and I was on the story panel, and we picked Uncharted as another game gets an award, because what it did was the conversation between the two characters, the relationships, the personality of Sully that came out, just in their quips, their barks, as they call them, the things they say to each other while they're in action, that made those characters come alive.
Sure.
So the action of the game, the player was interacting with, I'm shooting people and I'm dodging boulders and I'm racing cars, but the way the characters would speak to each other is what won your heart. So that, I think, the best comic writers kind of understand that.
Yeah.
Because the character bits shine irrespective of what the large overarching plot might be.
Which would be
Excellent
different,
point.
Which would be different from like a game like Fortnite, which doesn't have a lot of dialogue or doesn't have a lot of story, because it's all
very emergent.
It's all,
Yeah.
all the action, right? So that's
Well, that's the players talking amongst themselves, so it makes up the dialogue. So that's right. Yeah, that's the whole thing. So we've given you a bunch of stuff and told you why we're here. Is there anybody that would like to ask us anything specific to their own situation? I believe the mic works, so step right up or stand up and speak real loud so everybody can hear you. We'd love to. We don't want you to walk away from here and not get the questions answered you came to have answered.
Oddworld, by the way, probably one of my favorite games.
Just move your mask down a little bit or get closer to the mic or something. There you go. There you go. Good.
I noticed a few of you are creative directors. Is there any advice you can give to another creative director as far as like burnout? Is there anything that you guys do when you're kind of hitting a block and you're not too sure where to go?
These are full of vodka.
If only.
There was a story about the hard-boiled fiction writer Mickey Spillane, who, when he was between books, he'd get blocked and he couldn't figure out what to do next. And then he'd get a call from his accountant and say, "Hey, Mick, the money's about to run out." And then he got a novel. It was amazing. So, in my case, I dare say in our case, we can't afford it, right?
Yeah.
You can't afford to get blocked. You just gotta figure it out.
Yeah, there's an aspect of doing it every day, even if it's not that day that you're feeling inspired, right? I don't think you should get into this field, especially in games, if you think you have to be inspired every day, because that's a pretty tough grind. But what you can do is keep reminding yourself why you got into it in the first place. Like I won't say my age, but I'm older than I'd like to be, and I've been reading comic books since I've been 9 years old, and I still love comic books. And sometimes I've fallen out of love for a couple of years, and I haven't come back to it, but I still love comics. Same with games. I still love high-end, video games on the Sony and Xbox. I still love mobile games. I like all games. I love board games, all games of all types, right? So find what you love. Sometimes if you're like with me, I'm doing mobile games all the time, so they drive me crazy after a while. So I play board games with my wife, and that's how I stay sort of inspired and try to bring stuff back to what it is. Just don't forget what you love.
And I have an otter plan that works for me, may not work for you, which I have other things to do. And And so if I'm blocked on a project that I'm working on,
Yeah, no.
I'll work on something of my own. And then, so I'll put that project, even if that project has a tight deadline, I'll just step away for a while, go think of something else. And, even if it's just go for a walk or work on my own project, or I'll call these guys and just we'll BS about not my problem in particular, but just start talking about games and comics and toys and movies and TV shows. And then all of a sudden that sort of opens up a floodgate after a while, and you learn how to sort of recenter yourself and get back to the project that you were blocked on.
Yeah, the cool thing about the human brain is when you've got a problem, if you stop thinking about it actively, it's still running around in the back of your head, and your brain's still trying to solve it, but you're not having to spend conscious time dedicated to it.
Yeah, that counts for a lot. Go ahead, Tom.
One of the things I never do is I never beat myself up. I never. Then again, I'm also stupid. So, but I don't doubt myself. I don't second guess myself. I don't think, oh my God, I'm ruined. I'm awful. I should quit. I never think that. I just think this is a small block, because if I overthink the block, then I've made it into a much bigger problem. So it's better to just sort of step back a little bit, get a little perspective, go do something else.
Yeah, you got to be your own best fan, and I gave you a very flip answer, and I apologize for that. I mean, labor is necessary, labor is noble. We're very privileged. We can make a living in creative arts, and I'm thankful for that every day. I did have when I had a creative or game director position at Capcom in Vancouver very briefly, and one of the guys came up to me and said, "How do you do it? How do you figure it out? How do you know what to do?" And I told him, well, I don't know what to do, but I know by the time the end of the day rolls around, I'll have figured it out. And that was kind of like my secret sauce, that I didn't beat myself up too bad. I was willing to accept an imperfect choice. I'm willing to change it later if a better thing suggests itself. I hoard blame, share credit, and try to make your people better, because you can't do it by yourself. And having think time, being able to walk away from something and let it accrete and then solve itself, that's a gift.
There's a great book from Stephen Pressfield, actually, called The War of Art. And it's a short book. You could read it in a day easily, 4 or 5 hours, and there's an audio version of it. And every couple of months, I'll just put it on in the background. And it's for artists of any kind. And it's like, how do you break block? And he goes into where he's like, I didn't even get famous until I was 50, right? And it tells you like how he had to do it, and talks to other authors and stuff. It's a great book.
Well, and Tom and I have the same morning routine. We get up and we walk an extensive distance, and he's run into the same thing I have, which is if I'm walking and I'm not like engaged, right? I didn't take my headphones and I'm not listening to something. I'm just walking and paying attention and breathing, right? My brain works out all sorts of stuff. I mean, I had some significant startup problems with BDQ Tavern, and I went on a walk and I came home and I was like, I wrote down a half page of stuff that basically solved the whole problem, and it's just because I let my mind do it when I wasn't concentrating on it.
I'd say you were in a meditative state.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
No,
sure,
you really
yeah.
were. Right? It's like the shower thought, same thing.
Yeah.
Right? So you put your body in kind of this autonomous state of driving across town, right?
Yeah,
So
driving's another great way to
Right.
think of stuff that you normally don't
And it's
think of.
because
Yeah.
you're engaged in a ritualistic set of motions that isolates your subconscious and
Yep.
allows it to range someplace, and you will discover things that way. So if you're constantly in a fight and reacting to stuff and you don't have the opportunity to do that, then yeah, it's really, really, really hard. So find those autonomous moments when your mind can wander, brushing your teeth in the morning, right? And when your body takes over, your mind is free, and you'll find the
But
answer.
weird stuff like make a big meal.
Another question.
Yeah, come please.
Question.
Hi.
Hi.
Let me take down my mask.
Yeah, who are you? What's your name?
My name is Leslie.
Hi, Leslie.
Hello.
Hi, I'm really appreciating this panel. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom.
Well, thanks for coming out.
No problem. So I'm in the animation industry, and I noticed that they're grappling with, how to get people to access, positions in the industry, especially if you're coming from underrepresented communities. And I'm really curious about this UA, UX artists.
UI, UX.
UI,
User
UX.
interface, user experience.
Yeah, so I'm curious from, like thinking as a high school kid who wants to get in the game industry, but also, they're thinking about they need a job that can sustain themselves as well as the people in their community or their family. With balancing those two, what are your thoughts on how to access the gaming industry, particularly those jobs but then also keeping in mind, you know, that they may not have opportunities to go to the schools needed or so forth. Maybe like an apprentice. Is there any apprenticeship type programs out there?
Well, not really apprenticeships, but what's awesome in today's world is, again, there's the internet, right? So you can go to, there's places like Nomon, and you can go to ArtStation, and they have a bunch of free like classes. Like people just put like, I'm a concept artist for Activision or whatever, and I do some stuff, and here's some videos for you to see, like $5 on Gumroad or things of that nature, right? So you can find the work. The hard part is finding out like what you want to do, and then the parts that need to fit around that. Like, so for UI and UX, graphic design would be pretty important, right? And then there's other components to that too, but the art side of it is that's pretty important, is the graphic design side of things, right? So, you know, if you got onto ArtStation, for instance, or you go to Behance, Behance is kind of like a concept and 3D type of thing, but mostly for graphic designers and UX and UI designers. So you went to Behance and you make a portfolio and you put some stuff up and start talking to people. They'll say, oh, you want to do this, or oh, go check out this cool 30-minute YouTube of that thing, and you'll learn a lot just from there.
And Chris's advice for UI UX is that's sparkling, that's golden. I mean, there is a legitimate shortage. I lost my guy 8 months ago, still haven't replaced him. Yeah, it's really critical for teams. So
it used to be concept way back. It used to be concept because I'm a drawer. I draw stuff. I can draw Spider-Man, sure. But now designing a brand new character that's kind of like Spider-Man but kind of isn't, and then your brain explodes, right? Like that was hard. And now it's less that, and because there's so many people doing it. Now it's UI, UX, and graphic design.
So what was the name of that? You mentioned again
Behance. Behance. It's a website that leans mostly graphic design and UI, UX. Websites, Java writing, things of that nature.
And in a weird twist of fate too, UI UX is not exclusive to games. So if you get to be really good at UI UX, it's translatable all across every industry.
That's right.
So it's the way of the world. So
graphic design is like the universal thing you would need, right?
Yep,
like,
right.
You just need to be
Exactly.
That's for magazine covers. That's for comic book covers. It's for all the things, right? Logo making and all that. Websites. So that's just
nothing more important than design on a website, because it's all about whether you can get people to stay there or not.
And then the UI UX in a game, right?
Right.
So it's
Exactly.
all
Yeah.
encompassing. So graphic design knowledge is important for that role.
Yeah, and the last thing I would say is in your portfolio, like one thing that's a hands down awesome thing to do is break down another game that's out there and improve it. So how you would improve it. Like that, make that a little project for yourself and say, this is what I do, point at what you did. That would be like catnip for me.
That's really smart.
If I found anybody that was actually doing that, was breaking down a game that they were trying to break in as an intern or whatever. We do have internships at Jam City, and a lot of companies do. That's the person I want. I want someone who's thinking through and thoughtful about their design, not just someone who's illustrating. I don't mean to say just illustrating, but when it comes to UI, UX, it really is about the way it works and the way it looks. It's both.
It's similar in concept as well, and even 3D artists, right? So it's like, here's my pretty thing, but it's like, well, how did you get to it, right? So for 3D artists, like, how's the topology on your mesh, or like, how dense is it and all that? Will it even work in a game? If I'm looking at that, or 3D artists are looking at that, that's what they're looking at. Okay, this person's good. I can tell that they make awesome stuff. Now, how can I use them in our field, to make the thing? Like, making something at your house would be awesome at one thing, but to get it to work inside of an engine, or all the tech that has to work in it. Now, what I do is, as a concept artist, I'm a 2D person, so my stuff never goes in. But I do have to take into account when I'm designing a creature or something that's got 55 legs, somebody has to build it. And they're like, I have to get that in the game, and the programmers are pulling their hair out because we don't have enough bones, because there's all this tech. And so as a concept artist, I have to be mindful of that. So then I have to design around that. So having that kind of brain, and what Chris is saying, having that in your portfolio is super important. Like, oh, this is how that person thinks. I can work with that.
And especially with someone breaking in, what I'm looking for is what that person's going to be like in 3 years. I mean, is it going to be someone who's potentially a senior, or a really great contributor and going to be a rock solid part of the studio? I don't want to hire someone that the best they're going to be is what they are now. So I really want to know your thought process. how do you think about the work that you're doing, and where are you going to improve?
So here's how to do it if you want homework, is take out your phone, whatever game you're playing that you really love, use that, go through every screen, take a screenshot of every single one of them. When you get home, open up Google Sheets file, it's free software, anybody can use it. Put all those screenshots in there, do call-outs and annotations for each one of them, break down that game and see how it works. And by the end of it, you realize, geez, there are like 68 screens in this game. I had no idea there were that many. And at that point, you'll know two things. One is like how that game was put together, and two is whether you want to do this for the rest of your life. Holy process. Yeah.
Also check the timing of things, like when that button popped up, like 3, 2, boop, and then it popped up, and now I want to touch it. Like that's important.
But you'll reverse engineer what we call a wireframe, which is the basic building block of the UI for a game, and that's a critical skill. And then on top of it, there's all the layers of the engagement, the timing, and what's hot, what's not hot in terms of what you're allowed to touch. That's all stuff that you'll figure out. You can figure it out right now. If you got a cell phone and you got an internet connection, you can begin to build your UX portfolio. Encourage you to do so.
So
Come on,
I have
got another question?
Before we get to him, I have one more dumb thing to add, because you were talking about how to break in and how to meet other people and how to sort of network. And I don't really know how to do that, but I know, well, listen, I told this guy I was stupid, so he's going to roll with that.
Yeah, well, I think that's as good a network as anybody I know.
Yeah, so we know, between us, we know pretty much everybody. But we didn't, like, I met Dave first, and then we started a comic book company, and that's when I met Chris, who then helped us start the comic book company. Then we met Paul, then I met Billy. And so we just we crashed together because we have like interests, and we hung out together. And so if there's a gaming community, I know COVID makes things more difficult, but if there's a gaming community, if there are gaming events where you are, if there are video game conferences that you can attend, if there's other stuff that you can get into, just start meeting people and talking to them and finding out stuff. That's no guarantee. It's just helpful.
Step up your social game. It's way more important than you think.
If you get yourself up to San Francisco, you can go to GVT and work with show, and they'll pick up your ticket. They make the count.
Let's get this guy in. We only got a few minutes. Go.
It's kind of off topic, but are there any technological sea changes you guys see coming? Like is like AI and machine learning, like farming things out to other companies? Like are there middlemen for that? Or is that coming?
Oh yeah.
There's a huge outsourcing. Like the other thing, if you want to break into the business, is learn how to run spreadsheets and speak Mandarin. Right? I mean, talk about skills that are never going to go out of date, right? So the business is globalized and it runs 24 hours a day, and we're setting up a project that's intended to be almost entirely outsourced. A cadre of maybe 20 people in Irvine that are the team, and then 500 people in different time zones. So I'd say that technology has been democratized and it is every corner of the world. So that's the biggest sea change as far as I'm concerned. As far as like big tech upstream from us, whether it's VR or something, it feels like VR is just around the corner, and it has been for 20 years. Will continue to be. So we're interested in that stuff. I don't think I have any.
But not just outsourced to freelancers. I think he's asking, is there going to be outsourcing to other sort of corporate units, right?
Or straight up AI, like is it actually seen in any departments yet?
Not even.
No.
We have AI in game, of course, but not the AI.
Yeah, not NBC, but
Not
we don't have machine learning that's driving
that grows
game
with,
development.
We do.
Mobile for sure.
Mobile is probably on the cutting edge of a lot of machine learning, but they're using it mostly for back-end stuff, and it's still pretty wide, right? It's not really narrow targeted.
So where's my robot butler?
Yeah, like console, not so much. Console, entertainment-based console, and MMOs and things like that.
Yeah, but any place you're trying to outthink a market, like a monetization scheme for a mobile game, AI is there, watching what you're doing, helping you out.
We've still got about 2 or 3 minutes. Anybody else want to step up? I mean, I hope we both entertain you and give you some inspiration that's worthwhile. Is there anybody else that'd like to ask anything? What about you? You seem very interested. Yeah, you.
Well, yeah, actually, I'm a longtime gamer. So as a consumer, because you guys know the skeletons and the inner workings, does that change your enjoyment for the industry, either comic books or games?
You're playing something, you go, well, this is just a bunch of BS.
Yeah, sure, don't meet your idols.
Well, the game, like I like third-person action adventure type games, right? Like the Uncharted and story based games, right? In that PvP and like multiplayer was always a secondary. And now it's kind of moved to the front. Like Call of Duty puts out a game, it's all about the multiplayer, and then they have a story. So I'm just personally, I'm noticing that shift in the last like 5 or 6 or 7 years, and I'm like, where are those third-person action-adventure fun games that I play?
Do you ever see something and go, oh, that was an amateur move?
Yeah. No,
Not really?
because I usually stick to Naughty Dog type stuff.
Okay.
So they're usually like.
I think the one thing we do, because we're sort of nerdy about this, is when we see an announcement from another company that's making a different game or has some new idea or some new technology or some new plan, we try to dissect it as much as possible and talk about it endlessly and try to figure out what they know that we don't know and if their idea is really going to work and if what they're telling us is actually the plan. Is it just PR or is it the actual bones of a plan?
We're always suspicious when somebody announces something new.
Right.
Because it's generally not new.
We
It's a Frankenstein monster of a whole bunch of old stuff.
It's the Marvel movie continuity to us in many ways, and although we argue about that too.
Yeah, that's true. We all the time. We argue about that too. That's true.
Yeah, so you may like it less, you may be wiser and less happy, but it helps I recommend try to be passionate about the work and not maybe about the specific thing that you're doing. So we're making a game that fits into the current genre. It's maybe not Billy's favorite genre, but he's passionate about the work. He's excited about that. Find something.
I like solving visual problems. That's the key for me.
That helps.
Also, it's as you become a grown-up, you realize that like if you're an insurance salesman or a lawyer or whatever, and you complain about your job, that's one thing. But if you tell people, I make games
or comics,
and you have complaints, they're like,
I literally did that last night.
Right? Yeah. You blame you're right. You
I was having a beer and I was just like, man, I gotta finish this thing. They're like, what do you do? And I'm like, I make video games. And they're like,
oh, shut up.
Right.
Yeah, and it is worth reminding ourselves of that every day. Every day, remind ourselves.
You get that thing where people go, I work in comics. That must be fun. No, it's just like work.
Well, the bartender watches me come in and I'm just like, and she knows me and she pours me a beer, gives me a beer, and she's like, you alright? And he games things, stuff, and she's like,
loser.
pouring a beer, and she's like, shut up. Like, thanks.
That's right, I'm standing on my feet all day pouring beer. You be quiet,
It was
you.
pretty funny. And you get that check.
Yeah. Well, thanks for everybody for coming. Is there any last bit of business quick before we go? Because we're kind of out of time. Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope we entertained you. I hope you get some good info. Have a great Sunday. Safe travels home, wherever that is. Thanks for visiting Geek View Tavern. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and click the bell to get notified. Come back soon.